today I actually want to look at the psalm that we heard today and preach on that. I think many times we don't preach on psalms. I remember once someone asked me, when was the last time you heard a sermon on a psalm? And for the life of me, I spent all these years in church and I could not even remember one that was actually preached on the psalms. And of course, this was one of my Old Testament professors, so he had a little bias and he had a little self-interest in bringing that point up. But I think it's true, and I think the beauty of the Psalms is in their poetry, and I think that poetry, compared to other forms of literature, whether that's prose or narrative, poetry just captures things that other arrangements of words simply cannot. I mean, just for all of us, I'm sure there's that lasting power of the 23rd Psalm. Just the beauty of that passage and its simplicity. The promise of God's presence and deliverance are even more powerful when we ourselves are in our darkest hour, when we are walking through that dark valley, when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. It is even more powerful when we feel most alone in the presence of our enemies. It is when our situation and that situation of the psalmist are aligned that the full poetic power of the psalm is unleashed. It's almost like listening to music. I'm not sure if we all have that favorite song it'll catch us in that right mood. So whether that's a very joyous song when we're feeling like we're on top of the world and we listen to that one song and it just hits us right there, or maybe it's at the end of a horrible day or a horrible week and there's that song you listen to and that just the words the singer says, or maybe it's a blare of a trumpet in the background that just says, that's what I'm feeling and I can't put it in words. And I think that's why Psalms are important. And I think beyond that, reading and studying the Psalms are important because they teach us how we ought to live and to react to the ups and downs of life. In the Psalms, we see anger and lament, joy and praise. And all of this is encapsulated with a dialogue, a prayer with God. And it reminds us that these emotions are okay. I think sometimes as Christians, we're taught to have a certain kind of repression for any kind of negative emotion. The Psalms remind us that these negative emotions, even when they're directed towards God, have a place. So I just want to go. Let's turn back and look at Psalm 40 and just read it a little slowly. I just want to read a little bit. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the desolate pit, out of the miry bog. I wonder, the first time I read that, I couldn't help but think if that was this incredible understatement. I waited patiently for the Lord. I mean, just think, and then the next line is, he drew me out of the desolate pit and the miry bog. And I can't help but think, how does one wait patiently for the Lord when you're when you're in that place in your life, whether literally or figuratively, is that miry bog? This desolate pit, when you've hit rock bottom, the lowest point, and just a miry bog. I'm not sure if any of you ever spent some time walking through woods or maybe a flooded trail or stepped into really deep mud. I don't think I've ever stepped in a bog, but I've either purposefully or accidentally stepped into streams, and I've stepped into really muddy fields. Oh my goodness! And I'm sure that's not the worst of it, but oh my goodness! You step in and it kind of squishes in, and then and it's just like there's this suction that keeps your feet in there. And the best is when you've wisely not tied your shoelaces tight enough. And you pull your foot out, and then it's just like your foot and your sock just fly right out, and you're standing there, in the middle of like this mud, and you got one shoe on, and you don't know how to get your shoe out, not to mention your other foot that's still in the mud. To be in that situation and to wait patiently on the Lord is something else, because when we're stuck like that, it seems like every ounce of energy that we exert to bettering our situation just makes things worse. right? So it's not that just that things are bad, but everything you try to do to make it better, everything you try to do to right the ship, to get back on even ground, everything you do, it just frustrates you. And it just gets you deeper into trouble. Ugh. Maybe it was after struggling so much that the psalmist could finally wait patiently for the Lord, because there was absolutely nothing else he could do. You know, there's a sort of irony that the time in our lives which require the most faith are often our most desperate moments. Moments when the simple hope of faith is even more risky and seemingly impossible. You know, I think sometimes we have the expression, we've reached a point where there's all that's left is faith, but in those moments, faith doesn't always seem like much. Because in those moments, it's everything in our body, everything in our minds is telling us to grab on tighter. When to step into faith is in a sense to let go. I did a ropes course once, and at the end of it, you had to jump out and grab onto a bar that was a few feet out, and you have to let go. you just have to do it, and then after you grabbed it, you have to let go, and then they kind of caught you on a rope. I'm not afraid of heights, but there's something about doing that just really tripped my mind, and I was really embarrassed. Everyone else kept having to go around me because I just got stuck at one point for a few minutes. But that's what having faith is in those moments. And to keep on going, the psalmist then says, God set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. So in our lowest moments, God steps in, and I like that imagery. So from the miry bog and then onto solid ground. Whew, solid ground. In these moments, it is only by faith that we can go on, putting one foot in front of the next. I'm not sure if you've ever been in the miry bog of your life, and there's that moment when you didn't even have the energy to get up out of bed, and you just wanted to hope it was all a dream. It's by faith that we put one foot in front of the next. This past week, I was actually reading some stories and reflections from Reverend King's life with the holiday coming up this week. And there's one of the stories I read which really struck me, and it struck me because it was a moment in his own life where it was his miry bog. Throughout his ministry and his work, he received many death threats and threats against his family. And he recalls of one time when everything like everything he was doing was not working. And there's this one call that really struck a chord in him, and they called up as they did it in the middle of the night and said, "Listen, we've taken all we want from you. Before next week, you'll be sorry you ever came to Montgomery." And it struck me because it's one thing to do the right thing at personal cost, but it's another thing to do the right thing and have it cost your family and your loved ones. You know what I'm saying? It's one thing to sacrifice yourself, to say, I'm going to do the right thing no matter what the cost is, but then it's another thing to do the right thing and have that put your family at risk. I mean, just the strength you need to have to do that, that's just mind-boggling. Because I'm sure many of us, even though we do the right thing, even if it costs ourselves, to think that it would threaten our loved ones, whether that's, that's when you begin to falter, and I can't imagine what that must have been like. And in that moment, he says he prayed, and this is just some excerpts of his prayer to God. I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. Now I am afraid. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. And that's just his prayer, and I can't help, that's the prayer of the psalmist. Stuck in that miry bog where you can't do a thing. And out of that prayer, God answered him. This is what he says, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced him before. Almost at once, my fears began to go. In turning to God and putting our trust in God alone, And that means not trusting our power, our education, our status, our wealth. Trusting God alone. It is in that alone that we find the strength to go on when the going gets tough. We may have been blessed not to be in such a situation, but one day we all come to that moment. And my prayer is that we may remember this psalm. And then on the flip side of this, the psalmist says, he put a new song in my mouth. So it's not just that now his feet are on solid ground, but there's a new song in my mouth. I want to read a little bit of the psalm. I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. I see I have not restrained my lips, as you know, O Lord. I have not hidden your saving help within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. Having been delivered by God, all the psalmist does is praise and testify. I think all churches, what we need is testimony. What we need is thanksgiving. When God works in our lives, it means sharing that with one another so we can encourage one another. So it's not just, God got me through, but I want to tell everyone about this because God is so great. And I think that's something I think it's easy to lose sight of in the church. It's not enough thanksgiving. It's not to say that we're deluded and we look at everything and we ignore the negative. But on the other side, we can't just be completely negative and forget to give thanks for all the good that God has done. God, he put a new song in my mouth. And gone is the old song, that old song of sadness, that old song of complaint and lament. Gone is that old song where all we do is complain and nag and say, this is wrong, that is wrong. I think sometimes we can get caught in that mentality where all we do is complain and moan. And that's not what it's about. If God has worked in our lives, then we ought to have a new song in our lives. A new song coming out of our mouths. I just love the poetry of that. A new song, a new song. We start singing a new song. My prayer for us this week is that if you are in that miry bog right now, that you can turn to God in that prayer like Reverend King and like the psalmist, and just to let and surrender it to God. And if God has seen you through that, or moments like that in your life, whether small or large, then testify, then give thanks. Not just in your own prayers, but in front of the congregation, because this is how we encourage one another, and this is how we see God at work in our lives. Let us pray.